Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael and we're going to be getting right back into some more Reddit stories. If you enjoy the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Now, without further ado, let's begin. The story was made by a user named Soft Ordinary in the AITAH subreddit. The post is titled AITAH for not allowing my son to be punished after he refused to do his school presentation. For some background, I have 50 custody of my 2 boys with my ex-girlfriend. To make this easier, I'll give them names. My son George just turned 13 this month. He's a bit less physically developed than what's typical for his age. He hasn't hit a growth spurt yet and is one of the shortest boys in his class. If you saw him, you'd probably guess he's around 10 or 11 rather than 13. He didn't show any signs of puberty until August. This might not seem relevant, but it is. George is very bright, projected to get 8S or 9S in his GCSEs, and regularly achieves these grades in his mock exams and assessments, but he struggles with making friends and has dealt with bullying in the past. Things are better now, but he's still far from being a popular kid at school. As part of his product design class, he had to create a children's toy and give a sales pitch to the class. Last Friday was the presentation day and George was really excited. He'd put a lot of effort into his toy and the presentation. That's why I was shocked when I got a notification from the school app saying George had been given a after-school detention, something he's never received before. The reason? He'd refused to participate in class and didn't do his presentation. Since they're not allowed phones during school hours, I couldn't message him to ask what had happened. When I picked him up, I could tell immediately that he was upset. I asked him what happened and why he didn't do the presentation. At first, he was hesitant to explain. He said he didn't refuse the presentation. When it was his turn, he asked to go later. His teacher said no, and that he had to do it then or get a C3. George said he couldn't do it now, but didn't explain further when asked, so he was given the C3. I was still confused as to why he didn't want to present when asked, so I kept pressing him, worried that maybe he was being bullied again. Eventually, he told me the real reason. He had a random erection just before his turn, and no matter what, it wouldn't go down. With that information, I think George's request was perfectly reasonable. He didn't refuse to do the presentation, he simply asked to do it a little later. Obviously, he didn't want to explain the reason in front of the whole class when the teacher asked him. His mom was really angry with him for getting the C3 and confiscated his Xbox. I tried explaining what happened and said I didn't think George was wrong. Since it was my week, I decided I wouldn't support the detention and would pick him up at the normal time. When I told his mom, she looked disgusted and said something like, "Why did he even have one in class to begin with?" I explained that random erections happen, especially in early puberty, and they don't always relate to sexual thoughts, which is what she was assuming. She replied, "Well, I'm not sure that's true," dismissing what I said. So I told her, "You might not be sure, but I am." She insisted we needed to present a united front, along with the school, and that by going against her, I was sending George the wrong message. I asked why her way of handling it was automatically right, and why I should be the one to concede. It escalated into a big argument, which we haven't had in years. We aren't friends, but we usually get along fine, and she's usually reasonable. She's saying she is going to punish him for refusing when it's her week with him next week, and that I am being an AH for going against her. Her mother texted me saying I was setting a bad example for George by letting him get away with being disrespectful to his teacher, which he wasn't even, just asked to do his presentation later. I respectfully told her she should mind her own business and that George was my son, but now I'm worrying whether I've done the right thing, and I need some outside perspectives. User South Karen said NTA. George's request was perfectly reasonable given the situation. It's important to support him, especially during such a sensitive time in his life. Random erections are a normal part of puberty, and he shouldn't be punished for something beyond his control. User Gorilla Boy said, "Poor George. All these adults talking about his boner, how embarrassing. You're doing the right thing." His mother is being stubborn and she is disregarding George's feelings. It stinks that he's going to be punished for something that was out of his control. Maybe you need to buy her a puberty for boys book so she can learn about what happens to a boy at that time of life. Perhaps give her a little more understanding. Also, that teacher is mean. NTA. User Ladner said NTA. Once you both are calm, I would sit down with your ex and explain that it's normal for 13-year-olds to get embarrassed by having a visible erection. Their body is changing and they don't fully understand. It's the same thing with girls too. Ask your ex if she remembers how sensitive she was when she began puberty and started having periods. Now explain that in a guy's case it's not as painful, but it can be more public because that tent isn't always easy to hide and everyone can see it. Also further reinforce that sometimes erections just happen. Yeah, if stimulated it's going to happen, but sometimes it doesn't matter. Men really don't have a lot of control when we get hard. The best we can do is learn how to hide it. User Oanashi said, NTA, did your ex go to an all-girls school or something when she was younger? I know it's not something widely talked about, but it happens. Punishing him for something he couldn't control isn't the way to handle this. Like seriously, how can his grandma think what happened to him is being disrespectful to the teacher? You might want to, with George's permission, talk to the school administration privately about this. It's not fair he ends up with a C3 on his record when he had a justifiable reason, and as long as the teacher can be trusted not to scream the reason out loud in front of his class, I'm betting they'll understand if they've spent enough time with kids his age. Not to mention that if you can get the school to back down, that takes care of your ex's united front reasoning for punishing him too. The most important thing you can do, no matter what, is be there for George. Make sure he knows you understand completely what happened. Share an embarrassing tale or two from your school days if you have them so he knows this happens to other people, and it's not the end of the world like he might feel it is. 1 week later, OP provided an update. I wanted to come on and give a little update about how I handled everything with George and his school, and clarify some things as well. I'm writing this on Sunday, and it's currently half term for George, so he has a week off school. Firstly, George was never able to give his presentation, which he was really upset about because he had worked so hard on it, but the presentations aren't graded. I think this was a difference between the US and English education systems. We don't generally have graded projects, at least I never did, and neither does George. At George's school, he gets his effort grades at the end of each term, and he does a mock GCSE style exam at the end of each year, which we're given the results for, but these don't actually matter. They're just to give insight into how they're doing and to give practice for his real GCSEs when he's in year 11. On to another thing, many people commented that I should have shown him the old lift and tuck. I can tell you he already knows the trick. His school requires that he wears formal suit trousers, and if anyone has worn those types of trousers before, you know you can't do the lift and tuck effectively, and even if you could, a large bulge would still be easily noticeable. Okay, on to what happened with his school. His head of year rang me after school on Tuesday and we arranged a meeting on Wednesday. I told George that he didn't have to share the details of exactly why he didn't want to do the presentation unless he felt comfortable sharing it. I wasn't going to force it out of him. The class teacher who gave him the after-school detention didn't come to the meeting, so it was just me, George, and his head of year. His head of year is a really decent guy and he has a great relationship with George. He started by saying he was so shocked when he learned that George had been given a C3 since it was so unlike him, and asked what happened. Like I said, George has a great relationship with the head of year, so George started trying to explain. He didn't say I had an erection. He said something along the lines of something embarrassing was happening with my body and I just couldn't stand up when teacher called me. He looked slightly puzzled for a brief moment, but then I think realized what George was trying to say and said something like, "Oh, no need to explain further. I was a teen once too. I understand." I went on to say how they're aware he has a history of bullying and he struggles with friends, and how I felt the teacher could have handled the situation differently. Head of year agreed, said he would discuss it with the teacher and he would cancel the C3 for George. I thanked him and he encouraged George to come to him with any problems in future instead of just getting upset and staying quiet. I thanked him again. Now on to George's mother. I wish I could say things went as well with her as they did with the school. I'm honestly not sure what's up with her, but she isn't usually like this. A lot of people were commenting that she sounds very unreasonable. In that moment I do agree with you, but normally she is not like that, and we have a great friendship even though we are not in a romantic relationship anymore. She ended up ringing George to tell him that she wanted him to go to the C3 whether it had been cancelled or not. George rightfully said that was ridiculous and that he wasn't going to do that. They both ended up having a huge argument. She sent me a tirade of messages about how disrespectful I am, how I was raising him to be entitled, how he'll end up in prison because he doesn't understand consequences. I turned off the notifications for her messages and just left her to it. I am meant to drop the boys off at her house tomorrow for her week with them, but George has said he doesn't doesn't want to go. At this point, I am of two minds on whether to support that decision or not. On one hand, I wouldn't want her to ever encourage either of the boys to not spend their week with me, but on the other hand, it should be his choice. I feel like I'm walking on thin ice here, and I am honestly not sure how to navigate it. I could stay out of it completely and just let him make the choice, but maybe encourage him to spend his week with her, because I think that's how I would like her to handle it. I do feel really conflicted. If you read all this, thank you. User Samarkand said, you might want to check if she's gotten into the sort of online groups that encourage tough love or authoritarian parenting. It sounds a bit like the sort of situation where someone was a normal conservative before suddenly starting to spout off about the storm and how vaccines are mind control enabled by 5G cell phone signals. Something might have gotten into her mind to cause it to rot. User Tired Unicorn said, I am so glad you got to have a good talk with the head of year and clear things up with the school. That had to be a huge relief for your son. As for your ex, since her behavior is so out of the norm, I would recommend sitting down with her and having a discussion about what is going on with her before you send your son back to her house. Find out if something is happening in her life or maybe her health that is causing her to be so resistant to hearing you out and understanding her son. Her mindset to punish your son so strongly, especially since he's an overall really good kid and this situation is out of the norm for all of you, is really over the top. User Little Bit Funny said, talk to an expert to ensure that respecting George's wishes regarding visitation won't blow up in your face. In some jurisdictions, it could allow her to take you to court. I suspect your ex has unresolved issues. She seems to believe your son is a sexual predator, which is a huge problem, and I don't blame your son for not feeling safe with her. Is there any chance you can get her to make an appointment with George's GP to discuss whether or not random erections are normal for boys in puberty? This next post was made in the relationship advice subreddit by a throwaway account. The post is titled, My 38F Ex-Fiance Ghosted Me 39M Before Our Wedding. It's been 16 years and now she wants to talk it over again. Should we open closed wounds? I was never given an explanation. She just left and told nobody. It was literally right before our big wedding ceremony. She didn't leave a note, nothing, just left. Even her family was left baffled. She just up and left. We had dated all through high school and all through college. She eventually returned, but not to me. I had to learn via a third party that she had no intentions of coming home. She wanted nothing to do with me and told her parents to avoid having me around. I never got a choice in the matter. I respected her wishes. I never understood why she did it. My only guess is that she had a mental breakdown because she cut off all contact with everyone. We were both young and still growing. I don't know, but I've struggled with it since. Out of the blue, she messaged me on Facebook after all these years and wants to meet up. I'm feeling a mix of emotions right now. Angry, nervous, hopeful, sad. I still have feelings for her. I don't know if I could take her back, but looking at her Facebook makes me miss her. She's even better looking than she was before and single. I'm conflicted. She won't talk about anything regarding why she left. She said it's best to do so in person. The only thing I can tell from her Facebook is that she's posting about feeling weak and living a life full of shame, regret, and loneliness. This is dumb. She ghosted me and I should want nothing to do with her, but damn it, I still have feelings for her. I never stopped thinking about her. What should I do? Ghost her in return? Call her out? See where this date takes us? 2 days later, OP gave us an update. Well, that was something. I got closure at least. We met at a cafe and sat outside to talk. The first thing I noticed was how badly scarred her arms were and how much pain was in her face. Long story short, she wanted to break up long before the wedding. She was too weak and cowardly to speak up for herself. She had a complete nervous breakdown over everything. She had been tired of being forced into doing things she never wanted to do and never had the guts to stand up for herself. She was mad at her family for pressuring her to get married and have kids, mad at them for forcing her into a degree she didn't want, and mad at herself for not being able to speak up. Nothing she did was justified, which we agreed on. When I first proposed to her, I did it in a public area. I put her on the spot, and she wanted to say no, but couldn't bear to see me hurt. She was right. I made all the choices for her. I was a very different person back then, and she was very meek, just going with the flow and lacking a backbone. I often drowned out her voice and never gave her the chance to grow as a person. Back then, I was focused only on myself. Well, everything came to a climax and she had a complete mental breakdown. She ran away from her problems at the behest of her best friend, the only person in the world that she ever trusted. As she said, it's the only thing she knows how to do, run. She never had the spine to speak up. Her life spiraled downward. She spent a few years homeless after her best friend's husband kicked her to the curb. The rest of that time was spent in prison, although she didn't specify what she did. She was released about a year ago and has been turning her life around. She has a job, she's reconnected with her parents, and she's finally reconnecting with me. She never stopped trying to get in touch with me. As for our future, we have none. We both agreed to end things and go our separate ways. We are both changed. Two different people. We have nothing in common and don't live near each other. She doesn't justify what she did, nor does she want forgiveness. She thinks it's repulsive and is ashamed of her actions. I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't. I just forgave her. With that, we shook hands, said our goodbyes, and that will likely be the last time we ever see one another. It's bittersweet. I got the closure I wanted. We both did. It feels like a burden has been released. I know now that we never had a future together and never will. But on the other hand, I'm sad because it's over. All these years of hoping something would happen were for naught. In the end, this is an ending and I finally have closure. Not many get to say that. Do I believe her story? Yes, I do. And even if she's full of it at this point, does it even matter? I've always known her to be very weak-willed and meek. She often just does what everyone tells her to do and runs when things get too difficult. She avoids her problems because she is too weak to stand up to them. It makes sense why her family wouldn't talk to me about her. They were typical tiger parents who disowned their problem child. TLDR. All's well that ends well. Our relationship has finally come to an end and we can move on. User MDM said it's looking like her parents lied to him about what happened to her, most likely because they didn't want anyone to know their daughter was in prison. He absolutely brushed over that part. Why do I get the feeling that a meek, weak-willed woman who never made any decisions for herself was pressured into an engagement she didn't want and then later left OP at the altar because her best friend convinced her to? But then the best friend's husband kicked her out, so she became homeless because her parents wanted her to marry OP. While homeless, she falls in with a bad crowd because she is bad at making decisions and ends up an accomplice to a serious felony, like drugs, larceny, or homicide, and ends up incarcerated for an extended period. When OP asks her parents about her whereabouts, they lie and say that she's not coming back and isn't contacting OP. Her attempts to contact OP through the years could have been through her parents, who might have been lying right back to her. It's a hypothesis, but it's a solid one. User Canada Kate said, sounds like the OP had no problem with her being weak-willed and meek when he benefited from it. He sounds like a jerk who ran roughshod over her like everyone else. That poor woman. User Mindless Top said, he was very clearly deeply abusive towards this woman and even now calls her weak. I am glad she got away and I honestly understand why she had a mental breakdown. I hope she's in a better spot and that she'll be happy. I also hope that he is better and understands his past abuse.